Hello folks, Dick Fairburn here. I'm putting together a series on elk hunting. Bigger than whitetails, bigger than hogs, generally out west, although there are some eastern states that have some elk hunts now. I've talked about the caliber you need to choose, kind of an overview of the issues that crop up with elk, which is like, what are you going to do with a few hundred pounds of dead meat when you're standing there looking at it? I want to talk about how to deal with shots out to perhaps 600 yards if you've got the kind of cartridge that can deliver the performance for that. There are several ways to be prepared for those longer shots. I think the system that I have evolved to, and not just me, thousands and thousands of shooters, the simplest, fastest system is to use a ballistic compensating scope dial. 338 is going to be my main elk rifle when I go to Wyoming this fall. This is the Leupold VH6 HD 2-12 scope. There are a number of other brands out there. I'm not affiliated with Leupold. I've used Burris, I've used Vortex, I've used Bushnell scopes over the years. They all have their attributes. I settled on Leupold one year. I got a chance to go through both the Burris, Leupold, and at that time the Redfield factory before Redfield went out of business in Denver. And I saw how they built them, and the Leupold operation looked like they were building space shuttles for NASA compared to the other two factories. So I tried some of those Leupold scopes, and I will tell you that as a gun writer, all the scope companies give gun writers a really good discount because they'd like to see you do articles, videos, and hunts with their scope being seen in the images. That's changed. Leupold, I used to get a very heavy discount. So I could get what I consider to be one of the best American-made scopes there is, probably the best American-made scope then. There's a couple others now that I think will challenge it. I got it at a heavy discount, and I was very, very happy with the performance of it. With the advent of gun tubers on YouTube, there are now about 50 times more people claiming to be gun writers than ever did before. And all of those companies that I'm aware of have throttled that discount way back. I still generally buy Leupold scopes simply because I'm happy with them. But now, if I catch them on sale at Cabela's, it's about the same price that I would pay with my writer's discount. So there is no major advantage in there that way. But I'm satisfied with Leupold scopes, and that's why I use them almost exclusively. The original way, I'll show you another one. This is an older Leupold scope. And this is on my varmint rifle. This is a Kimber 223, Kimber of Oregon, not the newer Kimber of New York. So it dates back into the 80s. If you wanted to make fine adjustments to a scope, you had to get target knobs. You could buy them already equipped. You could send them back to Leupold, and this one I sent back and had retrofitted with target knobs. I was doing a lot of sniper training, both getting the training myself and starting to do a sniper program that I taught. And we were working in either mills with mill radian scopes or MOA. This is an MOA scope. And our range cards were set up in either mills or MOAs of adjustment for various ranges. So we were looking for these target knobs. But what we found is, even though if you have a great range table, you laser range it, it's 385 yards, you got a number for 350 and 400, you kind of work that out in your head, how many mills or MOAs, you dial it up. That's kind of a slow system. I cheated this by some, and the 223 is pretty flat shooting. I don't really shoot much more than 300 yards on coyotes or something with this. So I've got it zeroed at 100 yards. I'm going to talk about maximum point blank range when I get back in and can show you some stuff on computer simulators. If I'm willing to tolerate some fudge factor when I'm hunting coyotes, let's say I'm willing to accept 2 inches high, 2 inches low, a 4-inch circle. So if my bullet is never going to go more than too high or too low for a given window of distance, that really simplifies what's going on. So while this is zeroed for 100, and I know the come-ups to take it out to about 500 or 600 yards, I calculated that if I zero at 100 and then I come up 4 clicks, so I'm actually hitting 1 inch high at 100 yards, that allows me to hold out to 260 yards within that 4-inch tolerance. So if the laser says it's 260 or less, I don't have to adjust anything. I put the crosshairs in the middle of the coyote and put fur on the ground. This has a duplex reticle. Duplex reticles have the thick outer crosshairs, vertical and horizontal, and thinner inner fine crosshairs. Many of these loophole scopes have a thin section from all the way left to all the way right is only about 5 minutes of angle. I think it's 5.1 exactly. We'll call it 5. A lot of the duplex reticles on other brands have 8, 10, 12, sometimes 20 inches of span between the points of the thick crosshairs and the thin section. Loophole did these because these were being used for police sniper scopes and they wanted those fine adjustments. So in other words, at 100 yards, at maximum power, if I'm up to 10 power, the distance of that thin section is 5 minutes of angle. Half of it's 2.5 minutes of angle. The same up and down. So with my 1 inch high, kind of maximum point blank range 0, I'm good from the muzzle to about 260 yards. The tip of the thick post, where it turns from thin crosshair to thick on the bottom, is a secondary aiming point. And with this 0 and the load I use, that happens to be exactly 300 yards away. So I don't really have to use these adjustments now that I learned how to use them. 0 to 250, 260, put the crosshairs on there and kill the coyote. If the laser says it's pushing out towards 3, then I use the tip of the post as my secondary aiming point. I'm dead on at 300 yards. That's maximum point blank range. And with a duplex reticle, that works. But to look on a range table and say that I need, 3.75 minutes of angle, that's another step, and it slows things down. But it's worked for me for a number of years. I'm not going to change it. Let's go back to the 338. What Loophole and several other companies eventually determined was we can make this vertical adjustment dial very accurate, very repeatable. So if you come up 10 clicks and down 10 clicks, it's as close to 0 perfection error as a mechanical device can be. They're really very reliable. And I like these HD scopes because this dial is locked. And I'll show you close-ups of this stuff. It's got a release lever. You push in the release lever, and now I can dial. It has minutes of angle tick marks along the bottom, but the primary numbers you see on this dial are distance. You chronograph your load, you contact the maker, and you tell them, this is my bullet, this is my velocity. You need to give them the temperature that you think you're going to be hunting at, because the ballistics change with the temperature and density of the air. You need to tell them your elevation above sea level, because the same thing, density of the air changes the flight of the bullet. The higher you go, the flatter your trajectory will be because the air is a little thinner. So you give it all that information, give them all that information, and they will laser cut a dial specifically for your load, your temperature, your ASL, your distance above sea level. So now I laser, it says 365, I push the button, there's 350, I'm going to give it about 1 more click, I'm at 365. Very quick, very easy. The competitors, a lot of the military shooters still prefer target knobs. And they still do their work in minutes of angle, or more commonly with those folks, mil radians. If you noticed on that scope, I put a piece of masking tape around there on that high dial. And I hand wrote in 100 yards, 200 yards, 300 yards, 400 yards. So I kind of made a dial like this because I think that's so much faster to use. And a lot of hunting situations are kind of rapidly unfolding. You don't have a lot of time to figure out distance, wind, and try to get on target with a moving animal. And I'm not talking about a running animal, but a herd of elk is almost always in motion to some extent. The cows are milling around, the bulls are in and out of the group. So the more quickly you can get your distance and windage figured out, the better off you're going to be. So this is a bullet drop compensator. Leupold calls theirs a CDS, a custom dial system. So I'm going to show you different reticles and how you can use them with a dial system, how you can use them with the target knobs if you're going to use MOAs or mills, how you can use a reticle that is designed specifically for holdovers. In the earlier video I said when I set this 338 up, I originally put a 2.5 to 8 Leupold scope on here, and it had their Boone & Crockett reticle. A lot of scopes now have secondary aiming points below the main crosshairs, and they all work to varying degrees. You have to have extremely accurate information of the distance involved, the mills or the MOAs secondary aiming points correspond to. I really think the Boone & Crockett is probably the best thought out. It's designed to be zeroed at 200 yards. Then you will have a cross mark at 300 yards, a cross mark at 400 yards. There's a tiny little crossbar on the reticle that's 450 yards, and then the tip of the post where the duplex goes from thin section to thicker section, the tip of the thicker section, is your 500-yard aiming point. And being kind of a fanatic, before I even bought the scope, I started running out the numbers with the loads that I was going to be using. I load a 225 grain Nosler AccuBond bullet. I load it at 2,800 feet per second. I've had it up to 29 in this rifle. That's when recoil is really starting to tell on you. Best groups, most consistent, was around 2,800 feet per second. That corresponds to about what factory loads are. So I ran out the numbers to see how they matched on the Boone & Crockett rifle, and what I found was hunting in Wyoming at say from 6,500 to maybe 8,500 feet of elevation, the Boone & Crockett reticle exactly matched the trajectory of this weapon. If it was zeroed at 2, the 300-yard mark was 300 yards, 400 yards, 450, and 5. Chances are your load is not going to be that fortunate to line up exactly with those. So you need to know whatever conversion there is. If you're shooting say a 340 Weatherby is going to shoot a little flatter. Instead of the 300-yard mark, it might be 315, it might be 420, it might be 525, but you need to know that. But the Boone & Crockett seems to match a lot of rounds in the Sweetheart deal, from 30-06 up to almost a 300 Magnum level. It's pretty darn close for a lot of them. So I had the 2.5 to 8, and I set this up for a moose hunt in Wyoming. I ended up taking 3 shots at 467 yards. First shot hit the moose, staggered it. It took about 1 step. It was standing in a lot of blowdown trees and very, very difficult terrain. With their long legs, they can step over a lot of those down trees. And about 50 yards ahead of it was a bog. And I mean, like, lose it in the quicksand and never see it again. So I knew we needed to anchor this thing pretty hard. It took 1 step after the first round. My guide is spotting for me, and he said, yeah, he shook his whole body. I had tried to hold in the same place. It had stepped with its head behind some pine trees. I held the same place, behind the shoulder about 1/3 of the way up, and the guide said, no, you cut a limb off a pine tree that was in the way. So we scored that as a miss. So I moved a little bit farther back. I came up for a high shoulder shot, still 467 yards, and dumped that moose right where it stood. Now, I will claim 3 hits, because when we got over to the moose, the palm of its left antler had a black tick mark in it, and on the back, the bone of the horn was splintered out. So I'm absolutely positive that was a bullet fragment from that second round that got interfered with a pine tree. So I'm going to claim I hit it all 3 times at 467 yards. That's with an 8-power scope and a holdover reticle. That system will work very well. And when I did that at 8 power, that's why I say you don't need 20, 25 power scopes. I think you can do it with a 12, maybe a 14 at the most. This is a 2 to 12, and I said in an earlier video, my other primary hunting rifle, big game rifle, is a 280 Remington. It has a 3 to 18 simply because Leupold was so far behind in civilian production from military contracts, I couldn't get one. I wasn't going to be able to get one for quite some time. But they did have a 3 to 18 with the same reticle as my 2 to 12. And I thought, well, this is perhaps going to be a longer range and can reach out further, maybe on a wolf hunt or something. So, okay, I'll go to the 3 to 18. So it kind of violates my 14 to 15 rule by a little. Same CDS dial system. I tend to work my loads towards maximum velocity. I backed off the 338 because that's where I got best groups. My 280, this rifle had been blueprinted, which means they take it completely apart, they square up all the surfaces, and they screw it all back together. The newer Remingtons probably don't need to be blueprinted because they're made on CNC equipment, and they're much better made. This also had a bad barrel. One of the magazines I worked for asked me to send a couple of rifles to cryo treating at a company called 300 Below, just a few miles from where I live here in Illinois. It takes a lot of the stress out of the barrels. A lot of knife makers send their stuff in for cryo treating. It kind of strengthens, toughens the steel. I would just put this rifle together. I had some factory 280 ammunition. I went out to sight it in, and what I found was this rifle shot a perfectly horizontal group. I'd get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The barrel would kink over to the right as it got hot. Put it aside 20 minutes, let it cool. First impact would be right where the center hit was, and then it would walk them to the right every single shot. So there was kink, some kind of stress in this barrel that was kinking it to the right as it got hot. Perfect candidate. Got it back from the cryo treating, and now I was getting about 1.5 inch nice round groups. So they took the stress out of it. 1.5 inch was about all I was going to get on that factory ammo, which isn't bad. And I thought, well, I can make this thing shoot. But I knew a gunsmith in South Dakota, and I sent it out to him to be blueprinted. It was also going to be rechambered for the 280 Ackley Express, which is just a very minor cut to the chamber. You can still shoot conventional 280 ammo in it. You gain about 2 or 3 grains of powder space. You can add 100 feet per second or so. And in talking with this gunsmith, he said, well, with the Remington Action, he said, the magazine box will actually let you extend the bullet out a little beyond SAMI specs. He said, I can deep throat that chamber, you can seat your bullet out, and you gain another couple of grains of powder space. So that was the plan. It was going to be deep throated and cut with an Ackley improved chamber. His reamer for Ackley improved apparently rolled off his workbench, hit the concrete floor, and shattered like glass. So he didn't have an AI reamer, it only got long throated. But when I got this rifle back and worked up my hand loads, I shoot a 160 grain Nosler AccuBond in this, and I was pushing them really hot, up to AI levels. I was getting under half minute of angle groups. You know, on a good day when my eyes were sharp, I could almost cut a 3-shot clover leaf at 100 yards with that load. But along the way, Hodgdon brought out what they called extreme powders, because prior to those extreme powders, the burning rate of powder varied quite a lot by temperature. It would give you a lot less velocity at 0 degrees Fahrenheit than it would at 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And that made them difficult to sight in for. The extreme powders, a lot of times, will only vary perhaps 20 feet per second from high to low. So I thought this is a great idea for hunting all over the country in various types of climate. So I converted them to extreme powders. This uses H4350, which is almost exactly the burning rate powder I was using before. I got my 2800. I got really a little bit better accuracy. It's shooting real close to a minute of angle now. But I thought what to do with this. The burning rate powder I was using in my original loads, they didn't really have an extreme powder that hit that sweet spot. It was either a little too slow or a little too fast. But I had an idea. I'm a little slow, but sometimes I catch on. The ballistic coefficient of my 338 bullet is 0.550. The ballistic coefficient of the 160 that I shoot in this is 0.531. That's really not much difference. So I played on the computer and I thought, well, if I bump this up just a little over 2,800 feet per second, which is 100 feet per second or so slower than my original load, if I back that load down, I might be able to get a trajectory match. And I did. 338, 2,800 feet per second. 280, 28, 25 feet per second. Very little difference. But what it does is match their trajectories almost exactly out to 6, even 700 yards, I'm still within an inch of each other. Same type of scope, same type of CDS dial. You get one free one when you buy the scope. After that, they're $80 a pop. All of my dials say 280 Remington, but they match the trajectory of the 338. So I had one cut for 1,000 feet above sea level. That's where I live, that's where I'm at now. I had one cut for 5,500 feet above sea level. That's deer and antelope country where I hunt in Wyoming. And I had one cut for 8,500. That's going to take me clear up into sheep country if I need to. High altitude elk hunting. If you run them out on the computer, you'll find that 8,500, it's probably going to work from 10 to 7 and still be almost exactly dead on. If you're going to a lower elevation where you've got a tiny bit more drop, maybe I know that, well, if it's 500 yards, I need to add one click. Very minor adjustments. So with these two matched in trajectory, I got two free ones, the 1,000 and the 5,500. I paid for an 8,500 one, and now I can interchange these between either rifle. I have matched the trajectory. And if for some reason my CDS isn't working, I have to use Holdover by reticles and reticle marks. They both have the same reticle, TMOA, tactical minute of angle. So if I know that I need 8 minutes of correction at that given distance, and for some reason my CDS dial is broken, I can go to that number 8 tick mark. That's 8 minutes of angle. So I need to know the trajectories are the same here for failure of the high-tech equipment. But if you've got it, you simply dial it in and you're good to go. So when we get back in the shop, I'm going to give you examples of the reticles and how you can use them. And I'm going to talk about maximum point blank range. If you do not have this kind of scope, and these kind of scopes can cost up to, they're pushing $2,000 or better. If you just have a very workable scope with a duplex reticle, that thick post at the bottom can be a secondary aiming point. And I'll show you how to figure out your maximum point blank range with, let's say, a 30-06. You can probably shoot 0 to 300 yards without any change to anything. It will fit within that 4 or 5 inch radius circle, and you have a secondary aiming point at a further distance beyond. All right, I'm going to show you how to do a maximum point blank range calculation. You need a computer program for this. It can be done on paper. About 30 or 40 years ago, I figured out how to do it on graph paper. And all I can say is it was a lot of work, but when I got computer programs later, I found out that my paperwork was fairly accurate. But nowadays, use a computer program. I use JBM Ballistics. It's a free internet webpage you can go to. They have everything from rather simple trajectory tables to some pretty sophisticated stuff. You need to input some accurate data if you're going to get good output information. They have a very comprehensive bullet library, so whenever possible you can just pull from the library and not have to enter this data manually. As I said, I'm using a Nosler 180 grain AccuBond. This Litz in the parentheses there, this means that a guy named Greg Litz, who is the ballistician at Berger Bullets, he has tested these particular bullets on his own. He tests bullets other than Berger, and he has refined their ballistic coefficient based on his research, and he is one of the most astute ballistics experts out there today. So if the bullet you're choosing has a Litz option, I would suggest you pick that. And generally, he's working probably in the G7 ballistic coefficient as opposed to the G1. I'm giving it a muzzle velocity of 2750. That's a pretty good solid load for a 30-06. This should be as good an elk load as you're going to get. You need to put in the sight height. That means the distance of your line of sight above the bore line. And with most bolt action rifles and normal scopes, it's the center of the scope is going to be approximately 1.5 inches above the center of the bore. But you can measure that and customize it if you have a very large objective lens. Maybe it sits up a little higher. You can see that it defaults to 10 mile an hour wind speed at a 90-degree angle, so we're going to use that to calculate wind stuff in the next video that I'll put together. Here's where you set the range for your table, and I have set this to a 5-yard increment, which is usually a lot finer than they're going to need, but this will help you isolate 0 points and things of that sort. For the first one, I'm just going to zero it at 100 yards. I've set the temperature at 40 degrees. That's your hunting temperature. The humidity you can round out. I've set it for an altitude of 7,000 feet above sea level. Probably a good all-around elk elevation for most states. The vital zone radius. When you calculate maximum point blank range, you need to pick a circle that your bullets will always fall within. With a 4-inch radius, that means all of my shots are going to fall within an 8-inch circle from 0 to a given distance from the muzzle. That's an 8-inch, it's smaller than a paper plate. So putting all of your shots within an 8-inch circle, the side of an animal the size of an elk, is fairly fine tolerance. So I think an 8-inch tolerance is pretty good there. All right, we're going to hit calculate. It's going to spit out a lot of that data that we input. If you scroll down just a little ways, here's your output data, and you'll see a line here that says maximum PBR, maximum point blank range. For this load, it calculates to 313 yards, and you need to zero at 265 yards. Now, I have not found a way on this calculator or others that I've used to go direct to maximum point blank range. You have to let the computer calculate it, and then we will go back, because if you recall, I zeroed at 100 yards. So we're going to go back. We're going to change our zero range to 265. And we will now be on that chart. And if you scroll down here, like I said, 5-yard increments, you will see we are 0 at 265 yards. We are going to be 4 inches low. It said 313. That's exactly right. We're 4.2 inches low at 315. So you can hold from the muzzle to 315 yards and not worry about holdover. It's going to be within that 8-inch cone of fire. The high point of our trajectory is going to be at about 145 yards. It's going to be 4 inches low. When you're using maximum point blank range, if you are laser range finding and you know that your distance is around 150, you know the bullet's going to impact at the high point. It's going to be 4 inches high. So if you want to hold a little bit low there to refine your aim, you can certainly do that. But the point to maximum point blank range theory is I don't have to make any adjustments out to 315 yards. 315 yards is, I'm not going to say that's maximum range for this 30-06 load, but that's a good range to work within. I wouldn't want to stretch it a whole lot further. Now, I mentioned secondary aiming points. If you're using, for example, the Leupold 3.5 to 10 I demonstrated on the range, that has a thin section of the duplex crosshairs is 5 minutes of angle wide. So 2.5 would be from the center to the tip of the bottom post. So where is this going to fall 2.5 minutes of angle low? And if we scroll down here, we're going to see that occurs at 360 yards. 360 yards, 2.5 minutes of angle. So you have a secondary aiming point that will put you dead on at 360 yards. I really think for a 30-06, that's probably as far as you need to be shooting. We can look over here and see what it's carrying. It's got a remaining velocity of 2,247, which is going to be well within the expansion envelope. That bullet's still going to expand very well and perform well. Okay? It's also carrying, if you think it's important, it's carrying just over 2,000 foot-pounds of energy at that distance. I don't think energy gives you much realistic information in terms of how effective the load is going to be. Some people do. One of the rule of thumbs out there is that you need 1,500 foot-pounds or more for an elk. And at 360 yards, you've got right at 2,000. So if you're a believer in kinetic energy, that 30-06 load ought to do a pretty good job out to 360 yards. You can do this for any load, any bullet, any velocity range. You need to know your velocity pretty accurately, so you need to get it chronographed. You need to measure your height of your scope above your center line of bore pretty accurately. That will change. For example, if you're using a modern sporting rifle, an AR style weapon, that sight line is about 2.5 to 2.6 high, and that will change this curve substantially. So you just need to enter that information in and make it accurate. So that's how to calculate a maximum point blank range. All right, now I'm going to show you how to verify the ranges on a holdover reticle. And the example I used was the Leupold Boone and Crockett reticle. It can be had in several different scopes, and the subtension of the various distances on those aiming points are going to be the same for any Boone and Crockett reticle. So I'm using the same load for 30-06, a 180 grain AccuBond, 2750 feet per second. With the Boone and Crockett reticle, you zero your rifle at 200 yards. Now you don't have to zero it at 200 yards if you don't have that distance available to you. So we'll scroll down. I said, as before, I set it at 7,000 feet above sea level. So when we run this, one of the first things we can look at is where is that round at 100 yards. It is 1.8 inches high. So if I'm going to zero this to be dead on at 200, I can zero it to be exactly 1.8 inches high at 100, and I'm on that curve. So with this now, we can show you where those holdover points are going to be. The first holdover point, which is nominally 300 yards, is 2.2 minutes of angle. So when we come down on this minute of angle scale, we're zeroed at 200. It is 2.2 minutes of angle low between here, so it's about 293 yards. That's pretty close to 300. The 400 nominal holdover point is 4.8 minutes of angle. And with this load, that occurs at about 388 yards. So we're falling a little behind 400 yards. You can make notes on these. You can attach a little cheat sheet on the stock of your rifle. But one thing to think about, it's going to be about 19.4 inches low at the actual distance. It's going to be 21.5 low at 400. So even if you just round it off to 400, you're going to be within 2 inches. And 2 inches at 400 yards is not a bad flub. Okay, the 450 yard tick mark is at 6.3 minutes of angle low, which corresponds to 440 yards. So at this point, the 30-06 is falling 10 yards behind the Boone and Crockett curve. That's not real serious. We can see here that's 29.1 inches, 31.2 inches, so you're still within 2 inches at 450 yards. So holding for 450 yards, you're still going to get a good hit. 500 yards, the reticle is at 7.8, and that's going to be at about 488. Still pretty close to 500. 488, we're looking at roughly 40 inches of drop as opposed to 43 inches of drop for the 500. If you hold just a tiny bit high, your 500 mark is going to be on. Again, you can run this out for any cartridge. You look for those minute of angle drops below your 200 yard zero, and you will know exactly what that line corresponds to. That allows you to hold out to 500 yards. I told you the story of me shooting a moose at 467 yards using this reticle. I used the 450 yard mark, which happened to be dead on for my bullet's trajectory. So my aiming point was that 450 yard tick mark. I held it just ever so slightly high for 467 yards. I got 2 solid hits on the body of the moose, and I claimed the third hit when the bullet hit a pine tree limb, splattered, and made an impact on the antler. So this allows you to use a holdover reticle as long as you know those minute of angle or mil radian drops for those holding points. You can predict exactly what range they're going to coincide with the trajectory of your bullet. Okay, I know this video has been a little long. I think it's pretty comprehensive though. It shows you how to do a maximum point blank range if you have a simple scope reticle like a duplex. I've given you information on how to very accurately figure out your use of a holdover reticle and where your bullet will impact along those lines. You have to go to the scope manufacturer to get the subtensions, the number of minutes of angle or mil radians that those secondary aiming points fall below the center. But once you have that, then you can calculate that out. And the bullet drop compensators take care of themselves. What you need to go along with this is range finding capability. When I first went to Wyoming, the best we had were optical rangefinders, and they were, I would say, plus or minus 10% accuracy. The laser rangefinders we have nowadays are within a yard or two. They're extraordinarily accurate. I've seen them priced for a couple of $100 for a bottom end small handheld unit, up to well over $3,000 for binocular laser rangefinders. So it doesn't have to be an outrageously expensive thing to have one of those on hand, know your range, and then be able to make some very simple range compensation adjustments and get you on target. The last issue I will touch on very briefly. Some of you are probably asking, okay, well, what about with a first focal plane reticle? This is all done with second focal plane reticles, and what that means is the reticle stays the same size in the scope view no matter where you set your magnification ring. You zoom it in, zoom out, the reticle is a consistent size. With the bullet drop compensator, doesn't matter where your zooming point is, the center is always the center. Maximum point blank range is probably best done at full magnification, although in the case of that 30-06 we're at 313 yards. It's going to be 313 yards no matter where you have the zoom set, but it's probably best to work at maximum. To use the holdover reticles like the Boone and Crockett, your scope must be set at maximum magnification. That is the only point where those values are accurate. A first focal plane scope, the reticle zooms in and out with the image. What that means, the advantage to that is those values, if you're using, say, a Boone and Crockett reticle with holdover points, no matter where you are on that zoom range, if you're 2 or you're 12 on a 2 to 12 scope, those distances will be accurate. So that is an advantage for a first focal plane reticle. The disadvantage to those are that they are more expensive. A lot of the scopes that come in first focal plane reticle are larger and heavier. And in my opinion, they are really of limited value because if you zoom down very far, those aiming points are so small you can't really use them. So you need to be working towards the top of your magnification range simply to see them well enough to use the holdover points. A lot of guys are going out in the field with, say, 5 to 25 power scopes and using that first focal plane reticle. They're going for the Cadillac, the biggest, most expensive scopes they can get. That's okay, except that under a lot of climate conditions, you may not be able to use 25 power. So you may need to back that off to 14 or 15 power to use the scope without a lot of mirage or distortion. And there, the first focal plane is really an advantage because even at 15 power, you're going to see the reticle well enough to use it. It's going to be accurate at no matter what your magnification setting is. So if you choose one of those big zoom scopes, I would definitely say get that in the first focal plane. So if you use that JBM calculator, you play with it a few times, I think you can get comfortable with this and you can figure out how to shoot to 300 yards or more when you go on your elk hunt. And that's assuming something in the order of a 270 30-06 load on up. And I wish you luck. Thanks very much for watching the video.